Hi everyone, I'm Jess and I'm a PhD researcher at the Department of Archaeology at the University of York. Today I'm going to be talking to you about microwear analysis and a little bit about my own PhD research. Before I get stuck in, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Ali for inviting me to do this talk today. It really is such a privilege to speak to fellow Mesolithic enthusiasts and just to have a chat about all things lithics and microwear. I also wanted to say a thank you to Anne Clark, as if it wasn't for her sending the Mesolithic Deeside blade to me, I wouldn't have been involved in the project in any way, and I wouldn't have been invited to do the talk, so thank you. Okay, so first of all, something that hopefully will be familiar to a lot of you is the little Meso Deeside blade. So this was sent to us at York because Anne had identified possible residue deposition or deposit on the flint edge. And as you can see, on both the dorsal and the ventral aspects, the residue or the slight change in colour on the flint edge is quite evident. I had a look at this residue before it was extracted from for organic residue analysis. And as you can see in the low power microscopic image, it's quite a sticky black residue, which is all kind of positive signs that it could be something quite exciting. And by exciting, I mean some type of tar or birch bark tar, which is very rarely preserved on Mesolithic sites. But unfortunately, the residue analysis didn't come back with any positive results. Alexandre Lecoin undertook the analysis at the bioarchaeology department here, and unfortunately there were no positive identifications likely due to preservation. And this is something that we also found at Star Carr. So we also saw this sort of black deposit on the flint edge that looked very tempting to be interpreted as residue. But unfortunately, when Shannon Croft came to analyze the residue, she also found the same thing, that it wasn't bringing up any positive identifications. And this could be because it's not actually tar at all, or it could be, as I mentioned, a preservational issue with the environments of these Mesolithic sites being acidic or waterlogged. Perhaps it's just affecting the residue so much so that these organic residue analyses can't be undertaken successfully in all cases. However, all is not lost, because I was then given the blade to have a look at under the microscope. And as you can see, I did identify some use. And Anne has already published a really cool article about this online on the blog. So just to give a quick summary, you can see there's a slight change in texture on the flint edge compared to the flint edge that's more towards the interior of the flint. You can see it's quite bright, and this is all indications that there is some kind of use, use-related polish. And this is undertaken at a high power, so about 200 times magnification. From this, as a microwear analyst, you are able to identify the polish, and then you can actually begin to, in some cases, diagnose or identify the exact material. And by exact, I mean group of material rather than specific. So you wouldn't say nettle, you would say plant, because microwear is not that sort of nuanced. So as we can see here, the polish that I identified, I interpreted as a plant or sort of fresh green wood polish with a perpendicular orientation. So the polish was going towards the interior of the flint. This means, or is indicative of, a type of scraping or planing motion perhaps. And from the plant or soft green wood interpretation, you could suggest that this is similar to the activity pictured in the image of some nettle fibres being scraped. It's quite an interesting polish because with plant and especially plants with a high siliceous content such as nettle, you get polish developing quite quickly. So it's quite interesting with the polish that we observed on the Meso Deeside blade, because for plant polish, it's not actually that well developed. You can see on the very, very edge that there are the beginnings of some smoothing happening. So it is developing, but it's not substantially developed as much as we have seen experimentally and also on other archaeological flint tools. So this is why I interpreted that the blade may have been used for only a short use duration. So following on from the Meso Deeside blade, I wanted to just give a bit of background about microwear and also what insights we can gain from microwear that perhaps we can't from other technological types of analysis. So it may sound like I'm stating the obvious, but tools were made for a use. And although typology, so placing things into categories, is really very valuable, in terms of understanding how tools were physically used by people, it can only take us so far. So for example, we can say perhaps that a blade had a number of different uses, but we can't ever know exactly what that particular blade was used for, because we have no way of actually accessing the microscopic sort of surface of the flint without microwear. And typology, like I said, it is so valuable and it's fundamental to my own work. And the work by Chantal Canella has been an incredibly useful and integral foundation for all of my studies. But it can only go so far. And I think with some typological assessments, such as the grouping of scrapers, for example, it is loaded with quite a lot of assumptions. So the word scraper in itself is assuming its function. Whereas we know that from microwear analysis, some scrapers aren't actually used for that function. They may have other functions. And also with scrapers, there is another assumed function that they were used on hides. But we also know that that's not always the case for microwear analysis. So for me, that's why microwear is so valuable, because we can go beyond some of these assumptions that are inherent in our typologies. It's also a way of going beyond the tools and gaining real insights into the people or the hunter-gatherers, if we're looking at the Mesolithic, and who they were, the decisions they were making, and how they were deciding to use the tools that they made. So choices in using one tool rather than another, are they making really beautifully aesthetically pleasing tools that are incredibly taking a lot of time to make? Are they using those for particular activities, or are they quite happy to spontaneously use things quite haphazardly that aren't necessarily always fit for purpose? We can also access things like the range of materials worked on a site. So although faunal remains and potentially some pollen analysis or environmental data can give us information on the potential material that was available, microwear analysis gives us a genuinely accurate picture of what was actually processed or harvested or butchered perhaps by the people at the site or wherever you are, which again is quite unique. And also we get insights into things like curation practices. So flint is so abundant, but we may then assume that because of its abundancy, that people were people use it for short durations and then threw it away. However, we've seen certainly from Star Carr, evidence of curation practices over time, with people taking care with their tools and actually maintaining them and keeping them potentially within one of the structures as almost to curate them and to look after them, so they weren't just disposable, short use types of tools. And also, as similarly we've seen with the Meso Deeside blade, we also get insights into these invisible types of material culture. And this is something without microwear, we really don't know what is actually being created or made. So from pollen, you would know that perhaps nettle was present at a site, but it would be an assumption or based on conjecture if you were to then say that nettle was used for processing. Whereas from microwear, we can see actually that people were processing or scraping nettle to extract the fibres, perhaps. It's worth mentioning as well that microwear does go beyond function. So we don't just look at tool use. We look at the whole biography of a tool through microwear. So it's not just about use, it's about how it was created in some ways, how it was looked after and maintained through its lifetime, and also how it was deposited. And all of these things we can sometimes get glimpses of through microwear analysis. It's also worth noting that microwear can go beyond just the types of polish that we see on the flint edge. So we sometimes, as with the Deeside blade, can identify residues on the flint surface and get a really close idea of the type of residue that we're seeing from the microscope as well. And this in turn can give us an idea about the depositional context of tools as well. So you can look at tools under a microscope and quite quickly see if there's patination, for example, or adhering archaeological or non-archaeological residues that may have been introduced from the deposition. It's also worth saying that the microwear analysis as a method is not just limited to flint tools. So as you can see at the bottom there, there's some really incredible work by Annelou van Heijn, who has done a lot of work on bone and antler tools and microwear analysis of those particular tools. And again, they're not as often preserved in Mesolithic contexts, but they still can be, and some really incredible results that you can get from that as well. But the polish develops in a very different way because obviously it's a completely different type of material. And also, it's really important to say that microwear is not just limited to looking at tools. So although that is my focus for my PhD, and it is a focus, I would say generally, of microwear, more and more now we're seeing microwear being applied to other objects like ornaments, for example. So as you can see in the picture at the top there, you've got these beautiful shell beads. And so microwear can be used to look at the perforations, for example. So by looking at the perforation at high magnification, you can begin to see whether it's particularly worn. So if the perforation's worn, perhaps it was used quite frequently, or it was strung on a string and it was moving along or moving across a lot on this string. Or if there's not that much wear on the perforation, perhaps the shell was attached to someone's clothing, so it was quite stationary and quite stable. So all of these insights that you can get from microwear with a range of materials, but also for a range of different types of objects as well. So just to give you a really brief rundown about the history of microwear and how it came to certainly Western research, it's the definition of generally of microwear you can see at the top there, which hints on this idea, as I was saying, of it not just being about use, but also manufacture, curation and deposition as well. And also the history of it is linked in quite an unusual way, I think. So people were obviously interested in prehistoric stone tools, have been interested in them for a very long time. And it was in the 1870s that you begin to see a use of ethnographic analogy. So researchers would use analogies from Native American communities to interpret how they were used, or how prehistoric stone tools were used. So if a similar tool was identified from a Native American community and they would observe the way that it was used in that particular context, they would then extrapolate that onto the archaeological record. And then in the early 20th century, we see quite a big shift where people started observing the archaeological tools themselves. And polish began to be observed on some tools, which prompted some experimentation. So individuals were wanting to see how this polish was developing and kind of what it actually meant in terms of the tool's use. And then Sergei Semenov was a huge influencer for Microwear, and really you see such a huge swathe of research then from about the 1950s, 60s onwards within Western contexts from after his English translation of his work was published. So a brief overview of the method. So it's using both low and high power microscopy. And this means that you're looking at the tool from so low magnification, meaning that you're seeing more about the tool's edge. You're looking at more of the whole aspect of the tool, and you're trying to use it as an initial preliminary assessment of the flint. So does it look like it's been used anywhere? Are there removals on it, perhaps, that might indicate where it's been used? And then from a low power perspective, you can then use the information gained from that low power perspective during the high power analysis, which is when you're looking at it at higher magnifications and you get to see more about the changes in texture of the flint surface, which is what we use for Microwear, well, predominantly with Microwear. So as you can see in the image, once you've identified a polish, you can then think about potentially the different materials that it might have been worked on or might have created that polish. And then once we have an idea about the types of material and the action, we can then begin to think about the larger picture. And this is something that I think Microwear, it can be used even more so, and it could be used to do this even more than it is already, which is looking at more about the human interaction with the tools. So rather than just going, okay, we found a tool, it was used on this, with a load of other data, we can collate that and look at some really interesting ideas on different ways of people living, perhaps different ways of people using space, and also using things like different sort of fire techniques, perhaps with striker lights. And for me, this is where Microwear really does come to the fore, because we can look at behavior, decision making, and genuinely just look at the people using these tools rather than just grouping them into different groups of typologies. So Microwear, it's not just about polish, although that is what I talk about a lot. Oh, it's gone dark. Sorry about that, I just lost the light. So Microwear is not just about polish, it's also about this idea of macro and micro. So Macrowear being what we see from the low power perspective, with things like edge damage and scarring and residues. And that's what you can see in the image, the small boxes on the left of the screen. You can see these little notches, these little removals, which we would identify from a low power magnification. And from that, we can then look at the high power magnification and look at the flint and really isolate maybe these areas where the flint has been removed, and look at things like polish, striations, and then microchipping, which is even smaller removals on the flint's edge. So Microwear is, and hopefully I've convinced you that it's really important and has huge potential as a method, but also it is reliant on integration of other methods and techniques. And one of those is experimental archaeology. So we need to understand the landscape of the site and what materials would have been available to get a gauge on perhaps the types of polish that we might anticipate at the site. That's not to say we're assuming the types of polish that we'd see, but so we have an idea of the types of materials and the potential. And we can then use this to build a reference collection that could be specific to that site, or just help us inform our understanding of that site. And then we also need to look at the flint sources. So different flints have different grain textures, and the different tool types that were found at the site as well. And so once we have an idea of the potential materials and the types of flint and the tool types, we can then look at designing experiments that try to replicate perhaps some of the polish that we anticipate we might see. And these are usually timed experiments using archaeologically known materials and tool types. So for example, if we have a pollen record that shows that nettle was present at a site, then we would try and work nettle, produce a tool that has nettle polish on it, that we know is nettle. And then when we're looking at the archaeological record, we can perhaps see if we're seeing any of that type of polish on the archaeological tools. And this is what you can see here. So we've got a micrograph of experimentally produced flint. So this is a flint tool on the left, sorry, an experimentally produced flint tool on the left. And then we can compare that to the archaeological flint on the right. And this is really important when you're learning microwear and you're starting out, but also if you are unsure of any polish as you're looking at the archaeological records. So it's a really important sort of part of your analysis, really. It's a really important part if you're unsure and you want to check to make sure that you're making a most accurate interpretation. And it's just a little side note, really, that the York Experimental Archaeology Research Centre in the department here is a really amazing place for me to undertake those experiments, but also where our students can have a go at doing some of those experiments too. So we can build our own reference collection that can directly help us with the sites that we're analysing in the lab, which is an incredible relationship to have between someone, or between sort of having a collection that is actually relevant to the collection, the archaeological collection that you're looking at. So there are a few considerations when you're approaching microwear analysis and looking at its feasibility with your collection. So wet contexts typically are better, but dry contexts still do preserve microwear polish, but because of the abrasion with the silts or the sands in the soil, preservation generally isn't as good as if it's in a wet context, where it's generally less bothered by those different depositional contexts. And preservation can vary within one site, and this is something that I'm finding more and more with my research at Star Carr. With the wetland and the dryland areas, there's quite a significant difference in the preservation of the polish. So the dry areas are a lot, there's a higher frequency of polish abrasion, or as you see in the images here, the iron oxide staining, which is from the depositional context. It kind of adheres to the flint and it's very hard to get off. And then you also see this abrasion in the bottom image, which is again this kind of sort of soily or silty sandy soil that's sort of rubbing against the flint and imitating polish essentially. And tools must be bagged individually. That's a really essential thing when assessing the potential for microwear within any collection, to prevent, again, this rubbing against flint on flint surface, which can imitate polish. So hopefully I've mentioned this already, but with microwear, it is all about collating lots of different types of data to create the most holistic and insightful interpretations. So it's fundamental to have not just microwear, but an idea of spatial data. So plotting of the results that you've got, ethnographic studies for insights, and interpreting the materials that you're seeing from the microwear analysis, and obviously environmental data and other key bits of information. So just to give you a quick sort of rundown of some really nice applications of microwear in a Mesolithic context. We have a wonderful study from Star Carr again. This was in the wetland, and this was done by Chantal Canella and Amy Little. And they found that there was an intentional deposition of a flint cache that had all been used on for butchery type activities. And they interpreted this as the flint cache had perhaps been put in a bag or a container and deposited intentionally in this wetland context. And then that container had then disintegrated and left this lovely cluster of flint. So we're seeing almost like an aspect of activity, like a single activity there, that has been collated together and we're seeing this really intentional and perhaps ritual intention with the deposition of these artifacts, which was only possible really through microwear alongside spatial and refitting as well. And then we also have invisible material culture that we have been able to evidence, and this is really important for the Mesolithic because we don't usually, especially in Britain, get the preservation of plant remains. So microwear is so important to give us the access into these invisible material culture objects or artifacts. And you also have incredible microwear studies such as the Hermitage axe, where microwear was able to say that this axe had been used to chop wood, and then it had been intentionally blunted and placed within cremated remains, which again, just one artifact is so, you know, the biography of that object is so rich. And again, it's something that we only really would know, and we only do know from microwear. Otherwise, to the naked eye, it does look like a normal functioning axe, but there was obviously a significant part of its life that it was significantly changed at the end of its life to imitate perhaps the death of this individual. So it's really very rich in terms of the interpretation possibilities. And finally, hafting as well. That's another developing area where microwear analysis has enabled us to identify a whole new sort of range of composite objects where previously our hafts don't preserve generally in the archaeological record. So generally, hafting hasn't really been considered in some ways, except where it's obvious that the tool would have needed to be hafted. So we're exploring a whole new range of different tool types and ways of working, really, which because of microwear and because of the potential applications. So just to finish off, I just wanted to give you a little overview, a little taster of some of my own research that I've been getting up to. So as I mentioned, I'm working at Star Carr, or I'm working on the flint assemblage from Star Carr. And for those of you that aren't familiar, it's based in North Yorkshire, and it's an early Mesolithic site, so dating from roughly 9,300 BC to 8,500 BC. And it's part of a network of a lot of other sites within the Paleo Lake Flixton. And it was also, the site was occupied at a time where the UK was still connected to Europe through the Doggerland, which is a really important aspect of the site and its material culture. So at the site, there were at least 3 post-built structures found, and you can see two figurative drawings of them here. So each one has a hollow and surrounding post holes, apart from the western structure, which you can't see here, that's just post holes. So my research is looking at what these structures were used for, but also the types of activities and the sort of social interactions that were perhaps or not occurring in these spaces. So on the screen, you can see the central structure, which is the blue one, and then the eastern structure, which is the green one. And the little small circle dots around them are different identifications from microwear of blades. So this is just a small sample. I looked at 42 blades, and the results you can see on the screen here. So from a very sort of small pilot kind of study that was quite early on in my research, I think the potential of microwear can begin to be seen. So the pink here is showing a tool that was used on plant. So from these sort of spatial plots of the microwear data, we can see that there are 2 tools that were used to work plant, found within the periphery or within the hollow itself of a structure. So this one in the central structure, and then this one just on the very edge of the eastern structure. So we think that perhaps was the post holes were the edge of the structure rather than the hollow. So perhaps this flint was just brushed to one side, to the very edge of the structure. So what can we say about this? Why is this significant? Why does this help us with our understanding of the structure? For me, the plant remains, or the evidence of plant working within these interior spaces offers really incredible insights into the social interaction and the human behaviours at the site. We really don't know what the structures look like. They may have looked like this, like a dome. They may have been a triangular shape. So the flint is really one of our only very sort of few ways of actually interpreting what was going on inside these spaces. And from the Microwear analysis, we can tell that perhaps this idea of sort of a social interaction, or this sort of socially constructed idea of crafting, perhaps was occurring within these spaces, with plant working occurring inside. And although there's not a load of data yet, and this will be added to obviously as I continue through my PhD, but we can begin to look at these spaces as inhabited. They were lived in, and to an extent they were lived in, and people were active in them. Perhaps they were undertaking sort of plant activities like cordage. They were extracting the fibres, perhaps making cordage for things like netted bags potentially, or they were potentially making cordage for binding or tying fish traps together. Although we can never know the specific types of activity that was being undertaken, or why this plant was being processed, or these plants were processed within the structures, these spaces suddenly become inhabited and lived in, and we really are looking at the people and their behaviours and how they sort of lived in these spaces and how they used these spaces, rather than just looking at them as empty post holes and hollows. And for me, that is such a huge part of Microwear, that we are really accessing people and their individual actions and motives and behaviours that really it's so hard to get from any other method. So hopefully that's given you a bit of insight into my research. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. And I hope you've been able to get a bit of insight into Microwear. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions. If you want to email me at the email, the York email below, or if you want to message me on Twitter, I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you.